Welcome to our series on the Mythological Schools of Thought, where we bring you the history of research into the ancient sources of the Teutonic mythos. Here we shall explore the evolution of mythic interpretation as it pertains to heathen belief, while demonstrating both the truths and the flaws within each school. We truly feel that by properly explaining the timeline of this research, we can help those of our faith to understand the necessity of moving beyond the academic lines and welcoming the true reconstruction of this belief. Our religion was subject to centuries of persecution, and as such, the documents that led to its revival originally ended up in the hands of those opposed to it. Once we recognize the flaws within their methods, we can begin to discern what can be of benefit to our community and what must be discarded. We are the Epic School of Mythological Research, built around the method originally developed by Victor Rydberg in the late 19th century. From the very beginning of our school, we have always viewed the stories as part of a religious structure. The gods are not symbols, they are not fantasies, and they are not deified humans. The Norrøna Society has been working diligently for the past 25 years to develop Rydberg's method into a working body of sacred lore for our folk. This is our mission. This is our passion. This is our religion.
Over the past 3 centuries, multiple schools of thought have emerged regarding the interpretation of sources on the ancient religion of Northern Europe. Every method developed has had its period of dominance, eventually yielding to the succeeding one, yet none of them has ever completely disappeared. Today we still find traces of and advocates for each of these schools in popular books on Old Norse mythology and scholarship. In this series, we have examined the primary schools of academic thought regarding the ancient Teutonic mythos and have fully demonstrated that they are by no means conducive to the reconstruction of the customs and religion to which we adhere. By their premises, each of the methods used to explain the source material have proven to be biased and even hostile to the understanding of our ancestors' way of life. Historically, scholars have told us that these gods are anything but the native divinities within a sacred belief system. For us to truly examine the lore of our religion, we must begin with the premise that this actually is a religion and must be viewed as such in order to fully understand it. To date, the Epic School is the only school that has sought to do this, and because of this, our knowledge and continuing discoveries have expounded upon these ancient beliefs far beyond anything previously thought possible. We have examined the other academic schools of thought in our previous videos within this series. It is important for us to juxtapose these schools with our own so that we can properly examine the material as we investigate the theories and methods demonstrated and how these affect the views on our religion and mythic studies at large. In further consideration of these schools, one can easily make the argument that they focus more on mythogony, which is the study of how the myths originated, whereas our primary concern is the investigations into the stories themselves, which is defined by mythology. In order to further this juxtaposition, let us review the schools and their impact upon the mythological studies. Developed by Romans and Greeks to assimilate the subjects of their empires, the idea was that all gods are nothing more than interpretations of their own. This led to the belief that these deities were likely not native to their own lands. First invented by the philosopher Euhemerus, the idea here is that the gods were originally kings and queens that had fooled the people into worshipping them. This would later be adopted by Christian apologists to denigrate the divinity of the gods and demonstrate that our deities were once the heroes of the Trojan War. After the Eddas had been rediscovered, the theory developed by sophist Bugge was that these texts were nothing more than biblical tales retold in a heathen context. This has led many to question the authenticity of all the sources on our ancient religion, a theory that plagues these studies to this day. Reaching into the modern era, the nature school, also called the German school after its place of origin, sought to discredit any and all non-Abrahamic faiths by proclaiming that their beliefs were nothing more than the worship of weather phenomena. We often see this in the theories concerning solar cults, animal cults, animism, etc. Utilizing the terminology of Carl Jung while corrupting the actual intention behind Jung's work, this school diminished the gods as nothing more than psychological expressions. Greatly influencing modern New Age beliefs, this school basically relegates the religion to figments of the imagination. Our school is built upon the premise that the ancient Teutonic mythos was expressed through an epic chain of events that follow a chronological order from the earliest age of Ginnungagap to the prophecy of Ragnarok. We believe strongly that the Poetic Edda is a native heathen source that reflects the truest form of our beliefs, which can be used to compare other sources and authenticate or disprove their claims. For instance, the Voluspa gives us a glimpse of this chain of events, allowing us to flesh out the epic from the fragments left to us. In this video, we shall go over the history of our school and how the method developed through the work of Dr. Victor Rydberg. We shall also demonstrate its value and usage in reconstructing the faith of our ancestors. With a clear map and a proper methodology in front of us, we can restore our heritage and return these customs to their former glory. In late October 1879, Norwegian professor Sophus Bugge held a lecture before the Christiania Science Society concerning the origin of the Norse myths. He maintained that the greatest part of the mythological and epic traditions handed down in the Eddas were not Germanic at all, but were of foreign origin, primarily based upon poems and tales heard by the Vikings from Englishmen and Irish monks in the 9th century. According to Professor Bugge, the ultimate sources of these English and Celtic legends were old Greco-Roman mythology and Bible stories. Even when a genuine Teutonic god or hero, such as Thor, was preserved, Professor Bugge claimed that most of his stories were of Greek origin.
My main contention is that at the time when the mythological Eddic stories took shape, Norwegians and Icelanders were not uninfluenced by the rest of Europe, but that they were subjected, on the contrary, to a strong and lasting influence from the Christian English and Irish. In the 9th and the 10th century, before the German races settled along the Baltic, it was only a very inconsiderable stream of culture that reached Norway overland by way of Denmark. Norwegians and Icelanders received at the time intellectual impulses across the water from Western peoples who had long been cultivated and Christian. It was in this way that their chieftains and poets became familiar with the thoughts that governed men in the early Middle Ages.
In another meeting of the same society a week later, A.C. Bang, a doctor of theology, read a paper on Voluspa, in which he claimed that the old Icelandic poem was an adaptation, and in some passages even a direct translation of the Pseudo-Sibylline oracles, composed by Jewish and Christian writers in Greek hexameters from about 150 BC to 180 AD.
I believe that it is quite unthinkable that likenesses of such kind and extent could have arisen unless the author of Voluspa had had the oracles as a source and a model. It also follows from this that Voluspa must have the same purpose, the same tendency as the Sibylline oracles. The author of the famous Old Norse poem has not set himself the task of delivering a compendium of Nordic Asator, but by making use of the Sibylline Götterdämmerungs mixture of pagan and Christian thought, he, in the same way as the oracles, wanted to point beyond paganism, to arouse fear in the minds and the events of the last time and foreboding of the creation of a new order of things under the dominions of the Almighty, after the gods have played their roles.
These lectures caused an immediate sensation throughout the academic communities of Europe and America at the time. International scientific journals and newspapers spread the word of this new position presented at the convention.
Professor Bugge of Christiania, the living authority on Teutonic mythology and Edaic criticism, has lately read a paper on the origin of Norse mythology before the Academy of Science, an abstract of which has appeared in the Aftenbladet, November the 3rd. The results of Professor Bugge's investigations are of so startling a character, and yet so certain in general outlines, that a short notice of cannot but be welcome. Professor Bugge maintains that of the whole mass of mythological and epic traditions handed down in the two Eddas, only a small fraction common is common Germanic, the great bulk of it being of foreign origin, based on tales and poems heard by the Vikings from Englishmen and Irishmen.
Within a month of Bang's publication, the news reached the desk of Victor Rydberg, a professional journalist, author, and former member of the Swedish Parliament. His research into the Icelandic language had led him into a study of the Eddas nearly a decade earlier. Now, after learning of Bugge's and Bang's presentations, his passion for the subject would spark a new era in his life, in which mythology would become his primary focus. Rydberg's interest in the Old Icelandic language came about in 1870 when the works of Carl Save and Martin B. Rickert sparked a national interest throughout Scandinavia in the Eddas and Sagas, to make Icelandic literature a compulsory school subject. By this time, Rydberg had firmly established himself as a prolific academic and scholar, publishing many novels, political tracts, and religious studies that earned him a place amongst the country's intellectual elite. Born in 1828 to a prison guard and midwife, Rydberg grew up poor for most of his formative years, losing his mother to a cholera outbreak in 1834 and watching his father succumb to alcoholism afterwards. After years of moving through foster homes, his economic status was difficult to overcome, but his brilliance began to shine early on. He was an avid reader who eagerly devoured whatever texts he could obtain. Although this poverty would impact his scholastic pursuits, he was only able to finish his first year at university due to his economic circumstances. It would not hinder his desire to learn and acquire as much knowledge as he could, proving himself most adept in Latin, history, and mathematics during his formal school years. He eventually would learn as many as 10 languages, study a myriad of ancient religious and historical texts, and would earn an honorary doctorate from the University of Uppsala and go on to become a professor at Stockholm College, the foundation of Stockholm University. Due to his numerous achievements, he was also elected a member of the Royal Swedish Academy in 1877. The Nordic myths were known to Rydberg since childhood. A passage from the Poetic Eddas of Völuspá formed part of his first oral reading exam. During his years as a student, he produced a school newsletter under the banner Odin's Korpar, or Odin's Ravens, and had even tried to correspond the mythic information found in Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum with that of the Eddas. His early interest in the subject would deepen in the summer of 1871, while Rydberg was staying at Bjørslat, the estate of his friend and employer Sven Hedlund, the owner-editor of Gothenburg's trade and maritime newspaper. There Rydberg encountered Hedlund's nephew Henrik, a college student at the time. When Rydberg asked Henrik about his coursework, the young man spoke most enthusiastically of his Icelandic studies, and shared his fascination with the Eddas and Sagas, going over the poems and stories in great detail and discussing their contents. Access to Henrik's school books during this stay led Rydberg into an intense study of the Icelandic language and the ancient religion of the North, igniting Rydberg's passion for the subject. It was during this study that he first realized that the Swedish language could be purged of foreign loanwords by coining Swedish words for new technological concepts, just as the Icelanders did. As a prolific writer, Rydberg would go on to coin numerous new Swedish words, many still in use today, such as the native Gudasaga or God Saga for the foreign mythology. This effort would become a lifelong political motivation for the author, involving him in various pursuits. For our purposes here, we shall focus on his investigations into the Teutonic mythos. After the presentations delivered before the Christiania Society by Professor Bugge and Dr. Bang in the fall of 1879, Victor Rydberg undoubtedly learned of the sensational new theory concerning the origins of Völuspá from newspaper reports. His own employer, one of Sweden's most influential newspapers at the time, published a review of Bugge and Bang's lectures on November 14th, about a week after Bang's speech. Around the same time, Rydberg wrote to literary historian and folklorist Sven Grundtvig, seeking to join the Nordic Literary Society. In his admissions letter, Rydberg mentioned the popular new theory, stating that as a non-professional in the field, he would withhold his opinion on the matter. Grundtvig, a personal friend of Sophus Bugge, replied by sending Rydberg a copy of Bang's lecture in a letter dated December 12th, with the request:
"You withheld your opinion as a non-professional, but allow me to remark that in this, which seems to me to be the main point, namely the comparison of Völuspá with the Sibylline books, you are more competent than most, because it is exceptional for any Nordic philologist to have occupied himself with all Christian literature. Therefore, it would interest me greatly if you, and you alone, would take this matter under consideration as soon as Bang's presentation is officially published, for the question is of the greatest interest, that ought to be examined by others before the results can be accepted."
With Grundtvig's encouragement, Rydberg decided to take up the challenge, first writing his direct rebuttal to the theories of Bang in a two-part essay titled Sibyllinerna och Völuspá, The Sibylline Oracles and Völuspá, presented in two subsequent issues of the Nordisk Tidskrift, Nordic Journal, in 1881. Of these journal articles, the well-known theologian George Stevens wrote in The Antiquary, August 1881.
Against this last theory, the Swedish savant Dr. Victor Rydberg of Göteborg has written a brilliant paper in the two first numbers of the Nordisk Tidskrift for 1881. It is not too much to say that a more crushing and masterly reply was ever penned.
The late British scholar Ursula Dronke, writing in 1992, characterized Rydberg's response to Bang in this way:
Fortunately, Victor Rydberg knew the Sibylline texts better than Bang. In 1881, he replied to Bang's argument with over 100 pages, as against Bang's 23, of marvelously intelligent, masterly criticism of the errors, imprecise thinking and failure of scholarly imagination that underlay Bang's claim. And while Bang concentrated on the likenesses between Völuspá and the Greek Sibylline oracles, Rydberg demonstrated what was dissimilar in all the parallels that Bang had drawn. Above all, he sharply derided Bang's notion that the ill-put-together oracles could have inspired the structure of Völuspá, stating that this is no more likely than an aesthetically and well-ordered home should have as its model a chaotic auction room.
In his paper, Rydberg systematically disproved the correlations Bang had made between the Sibyl of the Sibylline oracles and the vulva of Völuspá, point by point. He demonstrated that for Bang's claim to be true, the linguistic abilities of the Völuspá poet would have had to have been far beyond that of anyone who lived in Iceland at the time, since the Völuspá poet would have had to read and translate the Sibylline oracles from the original Greek. Rydberg then showed that of the 10 Sibylline books cited by Bang as sources for Völuspá, only 6 were known to the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages through the writings of Lactantius, and worse, that Bang was intentionally misrepresenting the scholarly canon from which he derived his theory. Rydberg clearly recognized the overt Christian bias within the work he was refuting, and that the author was intentionally trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Thus, his tone against Bang was often sarcastic and demeaning. However, this method proved successful, as many have noted since. In the Unitarian Review, Volume 17, page 149 of 1882, the following was reported. Victor Rydberg, in a volume called The Sibylline Books and Völuspá, has thoroughly refuted the theory of Professor Bang that the latter is but a paraphrase of the former. In the same issue of the Nordic Journal that published the second half of Rydberg's essay, a brief response by Sophus Bugge also appeared, reacting to the first half of Rydberg's response to Bang's theory. After chiding Rydberg for his sarcastic tone towards Dr. Bang, Professor Bugge began by stating,
It must be admitted that Dr. Bang has been very wrong in not giving any further reasons for his assumptions that the Sibylline oracles should have been known in Ireland in the 9th century. Dr. Rydberg deserves our thanks, because in his effective exposition, he has illuminated the aim of this question with great clarity, and because he has clearly shown on what weak grounds this conjecture rests.
Bugge then attempted to demonstrate that a battle between the constellations described in Merlin's prophecy, recorded in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written around 1136, showed signs of influence from the 5 Sibylline oracles, in passages not cited by Lactantius. In his opinion, this indicated that more was known of the Sibylline oracles in the West than Rydberg had found evidence for. Bugge's objection generated 2 more articles by Rydberg titled Astrology and Merlin, published in the same journal later that year. As the author of such books as Magic of the Middle Ages, Rydberg had already devoted many years of study to various aspects of cultural life in the Middle Ages, in particular to philosophy and theology, as well as to astrology and magic, exploring the sources of medieval knowledge and pseudoscience. Recognizing that Bugge was an honest scholar only seeking the truth, Rydberg took a friendlier tone towards him than he had with Bang, thoroughly demonstrating the unattainability of Bugge's proposed parallel between Merlin's prophecy and the 5th Sibylline oracle in a way that convinced even Bugge of its correctness. From that point on, Victor Rydberg and Sophus Bugge remained lifelong friends, continuing to correspond for many years. After receiving as a gift the first volume of Dr. Rydberg's newly published Investigations into Germanic Mythology, Volume 1, which came from the author himself in 1886, Professor Bugge wrote the following in a letter to his friend dated February 1887.
I have read, and with every page I read, my enthusiasm grows. I've been wonderfully taken by the rich, fresh images. I have read with happiness, and in full agreement, surprised to find here combinations that in part have wound around my own thoughts, but also for the sake of truth, many times in disagreement and inclined to make an opposite interpretation. For example, with the many applications of the principle of polyonymy. Forgive these words from one who, confronted with such a magnificent and in many respects important work, such as yours, has realized that he is nothing more than a philologist. I deeply regret that your investigations arrived too late to have any influence on my final volume of mythological studies. So please, accept my warm thanks for your work, which is more important to me because you sent it with a friendly word.
Response to this debate on the origins of the Norse myths was far-reaching. Danish, German, Austrian, French, British, and American scholars all contributed to the controversy ignited by Bugge and Bang's lectures, both for and against their claims. The Norwegian-American scholar and future founder of the Norrøna Society, Rasmus Andersen, also weighed in on the matter, publishing an article titled The Destruction of Germanic Mythology by Bang and Bugge in the German journal Dachen in 1881. Professor Andersen also cast doubt on the correctness of the new theories. Like Rydberg, he was more inclined to see similarities between Norse and Greco-Roman mythology as caused by their kinship rather than any direct influence. The overwhelming response was that Rydberg had won the debate, firmly refuting the biblical school of interpretation at the dawn of the 20th century, paving a clear path for the rise of Indo-European comparative mythology, which Rydberg helped to pioneer, and the subsequent schools of interpretation that followed. The success and intensity of this debate would lead Rydberg into a focused study of Germanic and Indo-European mythology for many years to come. A letter from Susan Rydberg, dated July 14, 1880, shows that her husband was strictly occupied with this study.
Victor is most immersed in Völuspá and the Sibyllines, and sits all the time, from morning until late at night at his desk, surrounded by the work of Mr. Budge and a great number of other learned and serious gentlemen.
At first, he had intended to follow up this debate with a full-length article on Völuspá, detailing the findings of his research into the poem, but according to his own words, the intended essay had unfortunately grown into a small book. In September of 1880, Oscar Montelius of the Nordisk Tidskrift, after inquiring about Rydberg's progress on the forthcoming Sibylline articles, received the response,
"The fact of the matter is that, ever since I received your letter, I used all my free moments to study and write down a work on Völuspår and the Syllabines, which I intended to send you. The studies have been of a truly monstrous scope. I will not leave Sweden until you have at least the first essay, containing a criticism of Bang's puerile opus. After that, without any polemic, I want to treat the Syllabines separately and Völuspår separately."
From the early years of the 1880s, drafts of this work on Völuspá are found among Rydberg's papers, in an incomplete state, and no such work was ever published. Evident from this outline, during his work with Völuspá, Rydberg's thoughts were directed toward more and more myths, both in the Eddas and in Saxo's history. His growing awareness of the connection between the seemingly loose myths and their relationship to the timeline of events spoken of most prominently in Völuspá soon began to coalesce into the realization that the threads of a chronological epic enveloped a large part of the known myths. Rydberg's work would eventually grow to encompass several books, each with their own contributions to the recovery of the epic history embedded in the mythic poems. From the beginning, he intended to publish the findings of his research, accompanied by a retelling of the epic in narrative form. Toward that end, Rydberg penned several versions of his mythic epic over the next decade, as his research into the source documents continued, each reflecting the state of his ongoing research at the time. Since his discovery of a chronological mythic epic, Rydberg always intended to publish a narrative version of it alongside his research, proving its existence in the poetic sources of our faith. To that end, he penned several narrative forms of the epic as his research progressed. Sagan om Sverdet, the Saga of the Sword, was Rydberg's first attempt at rebuilding the epic, based on his initial theories regarding Völuspá's internal chronology and its relationship to other mythic sources. Never published in Rydberg's lifetime, the Saga of the Sword is composed in a more elevated and poetic style than his later attempts. Segersvardet, the Victory Sword, in 1884, more focused and much closer to the source material than his earlier unpublished attempt, this new version was published as a series in the Ny Svensk Tidskrift journal over the course of several months, focused on the story of Freya's husband as the central figure of the mythic epic. This essay, however, would soon be eclipsed by the publication of Rydberg's magnus opus, Undersökningar i Germanisk Mythology Part 1, Investigations into Germanic Mythology. The first volume of Rydberg's investigations, presenting the evidence and theories to demonstrate both the logic surrounding the full epic and the evidence for its cohesion. Here he fully presents the concept of polyonymy and how it is a valuable tool in reconstructing the chain. This work would be translated as Teutonic Mythology by Professor Rasmus Andersson, founder of the original Norrøna Society in 1889, and again as a 3-volume set in 1905. Later would come Undersökningar i Germanisk Mythology Part 2 in 1889. In the second part of the investigations, Rydberg focused on the Indo-European relationships within the Germanic lore. He not only demonstrated the antiquity of the Teutonic myths, but also established their correlations within a greater religious system. In a letter to Rasmus Andersson, dated January 1888, Rydberg suggested that the translation be dedicated to His Majesty Oscar II, ruler of the Scandinavian Peninsula's glorious people, the promoter of sciences, the crowned poet, and he revealed that he had personally met with the Swedish monarch to discuss his work.
During a congratulatory call on King Oscar, he received in an extremely obliging manner my wish, and yours, that your translation of Undersökningar i Germansk Mythology be dedicated to him, and, during the course of the conversation, seemed to have a good knowledge of its main contents.
Fadurneskuda Saga in 1887, Our Father's God Saga retold for youth. After being approached with an offer by a children's author to write a fictional account of his mythic epic for children, Rydberg decided to write his own version of the epic aimed at a younger audience, which would be sold in the Yule markets annually. This proved to be the final narrative form of the epic and presented the ideas that Rydberg discussed throughout his investigations in the form of a novel. The book would be used in Swedish elementary schools well into the 20th century, as a textbook of Old Norse mythology. Of Rydberg's work, Jan de Vries said,
"At a time when one was firmly convinced that the Old Norse myths were a late product, Rydberg's voice resounds. At that time, he swam against the stream, but he clearly expressed that which has become an ever stronger certainty today, a large part of the myths of the Germanic tradition, and that is to say, basically the Old Norse tradition, must be set back in a time when the undivided Proto-Indo-European people themselves created the vessel of their worldview in myths."
So we are done with the history of how this method came to be, and now we move on to its actual development. The basic premise of Rydberg's method is that the Poetic Edda is the purest expression of the ancient Teutonic religion, and, without emendation or interpolation, speaks of an epic chain of events from creation to Ragnarok. Believe it or not, the most revolutionary concept that Rydberg introduced was viewing the ancient Teutonic religion as a real religion. He saw it as the living faith of his ancestors, and thus approached it from that perspective. As we have seen, no other academic school has held this view. None have dared to regard the heathen religion as a viable faith followed by devout people for generations on end, due to the myriad number of biases they hold. From imperialist Romans assimilating conquered tribes, to zealous Christians claiming theirs is the original overarching belief, to atheists deconstructing the very idea of a coherent religion. Academia has shown that they are incapable of examining these sources as a living religion in a clear, objective manner. Because Rydberg saw this as an actual religion, he introduced the concept that, like all religions, it had its own internal logic and philosophy, held in common by those who followed it. All religious systems establish a foundation of order and a common worldview within their belief system. The Teutonic religion is no different. Rydberg demonstrates that the ancient heathen religion provided a consistent concept of the cosmos and how it operated, as well as a comprehensive epic history detailing how it was created, populated, and governed. He provides numerous examples in support of the philosophical and sociological nature of the religion, which lend weight to the certainty that our ancestors indeed possessed a shared worldview and an epic history in common, and that these concepts formed the central core of their traditional culture and religious belief, so that even as local and regional myths arose, they would be explained and eventually incorporated into the greater historic epic, if warranted.
The need for organization and order in the mythic ideas, and thus the need for an epic connection between them, arises and asserts itself to the same degree as a people's mythology develops from animism and polydemonism into polytheism, with concrete and characteristic divine personalities. With that, an epic connection becomes necessary. It appears with the power of a natural mental process. It is a product of the union of the association of ideas and causality. The material which animism and polydemonism create, which arises from the impression that the phenomena of nature make on mankind, cannot remain in a scattered and chaotic condition forever. To the degree of development of mental life, the power of order enters and works in this chaos to unite these elements into a coherent picture in time and space. In other words, the professors of nature mythology have never seriously understood that myths, as they already exist in the oldest literature, are god sagas. They are epic products, stories detailing the gods' kinship, their characteristic attributes, their spheres of activity, their battles to protect the world from demons, their intervention in the fates of men whom they have created and protect, their relations with the patriarchs, and so forth. For this reason, it never occurred to them to examine the vast amount of mythic stories for epic connections among them, and to investigate how far these connections extend. One should have questioned whether these events were associated and formed a chain or not. But this question has never been asked because it would break their school. The undeserved freedom with which they interpret each mythic concept as an expression of the sun, lightning, or the storm depends on each myth being regarded as independent and collectively constituting a chaotic mass.
From a heathen perspective, the only proper way to investigate this lore is through the lens of religious belief. When one strays from this viewpoint, their theories and methods lose objectivity and the ability to see the sources as they are, as the religious expression of an indigenous people. As we have seen, the failure to accept this simple truth can take one in all sorts of odd and misleading directions, which almost always end up deconstructing the faith rather than reconstructing it. As religious people, this is something we simply cannot allow, and now that we understand why this endeavor is so important, and why popular historic studies have strayed so far from the truth, it is up to us, those who truly believe in this religion, to take back the mantle and proclaim our religious authority over academia. Once the psychology of the epic is understood, then comes the actual rebuilding of it. This work, often tedious and time-consuming, begins by compiling the numerous chronological references scattered across the Icelandic Eddas, both in poetry and in prose, as well as in all other extant sources, comparing them to one another without any preconceptions. There is a method to this. Speculations about the origin, interpretation, and moral significance of the myths must all be set aside to focus exclusively on the epic points of contact and the timeline. The work begins by dispelling all premises. The sources themselves must dictate the results. The principles used in this endeavor are of the most basic kind. With Völuspá as a guide, each mythic episode must be individually examined, noting any temporal references that place the story at hand in relationship to any other. Every detail must be reasoned out to determine when the characters involved lived, whom they married, what children they had, who their relatives were, when each one was born, how they lived their lives and how they died, and so on. This places each character and their exploits on a master timeline in chronological order, as far as the sources allow us to know. Once you see the epic nature of mythology in this way, you simply cannot unsee it. The myths cease to be a loose collection of unconnected tales and become the living history of gods and human ancestors. Within the context of the authentic heathen worldview, the stories take on a much greater depth of meaning and philosophical understanding. When we view our sources in this way, we begin to see a chronological order of mythic events, which has gone largely unnoticed due to the premises of previous schools of interpretation. For example, in the Eddic poem Skirnismal in Strophe 21, Skirnir says to Gurð,
"Then I shall give you a ring, the one that was, burned with Odin's young son. 8 equally heavy ones drop from it every 9th night."
In this poem, Frey's brave servant Skirnir rides to Jotunheim to propose marriage to the giantess Gurð on his behalf. He offers her gifts from the gods, so she will agree to become Frey's bride. After refusing his offer of 11 golden apples, Skirnir offers Gurð Odin's ring Draupnir, which he says was burned on Baldur's pyre. This information is not necessary to the plot, and therefore must have significance. The fact that Skirnir now has the ring burned with Baldur helps us place this episode on the epic timeline. First, we know that the contest between Sindri and the sons of Evildi, in which the ring was made, has passed. We also know that Baldur has already been killed by his brother Hodr and sent to Hel in his ship Ringhorn before this meeting took place. Hermod has already rode to Hel in search of Baldur and returned with the ring Draupnir as a gift from Baldur to his father Odin before it came into Skirnir's hands. All these mythic events can thus be placed on the timeline relative to one another. Moving on to another example, we take the story of Skadi's arrival among the gods after her father's death.
and her choice of a husband among them from the sight of his feet alone, found in Skaldskaparmal 3.
Now Skadi, the daughter of the giant Thjazi, took her helmet, byrne, and weapons of war, and went to Åsgard to avenge her father. The Aesir offered her reconciliation and atonement. The first condition was that she could choose a husband for herself from among the Aesir, but must choose by their feet alone, seeing no more of him. When she saw the feet of one man passing fair, she said, "I choose this one. Little can be ugly in Baldur." But that was Njörður of Núvatn.
This story helps us place additional events on the epic timeline relative to one another. First, we know that Baldur was still alive when Skadi first arrived, because she wants to marry him, and we know that Njörð and his son Freyr have already come to live in Asgard, since Njörð is there among them. We can place all of the circumstances surrounding the death of Skadi's father Thjazi before her arrival, since we are told that this occurs after his death. This includes Thjazi's capture of Heathen when he forced Loki to swear an oath to lure her away from Asgard with her apples, which causes the gods to grow old. Loki flies to Thrymheimr in Frigg's falcon dress to rescue Heathen, and on their return trip with Thjazi in pursuit, he dies on the walls of Asgard, and the gods make stars from his eyes. All of this must happen before his daughter Skadi's arrival, and therefore all of this must happen before Baldur's death. In this manner, the epic placement of almost every individual myth can be worked out. The presence of these temporal statements in our sources provides us with timestamps by which we can reconstruct the epic timeline presented in our lore. If the ancient people did not have a concept of an epic timeline, they would not have included so many temporal references in their traditional songs. As Völuspá and Vafthrûdnismál suggest, there was clearly a concept of an orderly chain of events from creation to Ragnarok present in the old poems. It is simply a matter of piecing it back together, using the Poetic Edda as our guide. Recognizing that all important characters, animals, and objects within the sources are frequently called by more than one name, and sometimes many names, the second method Rydberg employed was a study of the polyonymy present in the mythic poems. In other words, a thorough study of the many names and epithets used for a single person, place, or thing in our mythic sources, and identifying who these names belong to.
The extremely fragmented state in which the mythic traditions have reached our time, the unintentional and intentional changes which the old poems have undergone, undeniably placed mighty obstacles in the way of the investigation of the myth's epic context. But above all else, what makes this most difficult is the unparalleled number of names, which, while common in most mythologies, has its luscious growth in the Germanic. When heathenry was still in full force, when the knowledge of myths and poetry still constituted the most important means of education for all classes, it was still possible to survey and to find your way in the immense wealth of names. But to the same extent that the mythic memories faded and the connections between the myths were lost, vault after vault of the colossal structure of names also collapsed. When the Renaissance occurred in Iceland, during which efforts were made to salvage and preserve what was left of the old faith's memory and its ancient poetic legacy, in most cases it was no longer possible to unravel the old synonymy.
In the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson created lists of alternate names of Odin, Thor, and Freya, and others used by poets in their craft. In Gylfaginning 3, Snorri says that Odin is known by more than a dozen names. In Eddic and Skaldic poetry, we find many more for the father of the gods. Grimnismal alone lists more than 40 epithets for him. In these Nafnathulur, or lists of names compiled in Snorri's Edda, we are told that Thor is also known as Asabragar, Eindridi, and Vingthor. Sometimes he is called by different names in the course of a single poem. In Himmelskvida, Thor is called Hloridi, Vior, as well as Thor. In Thrymskvida, he is called Vingtor and Lohri. Freya too has other names, among them Mardor, Sir, and Vanadis. Such polyonymy is a key characteristic of Old Icelandic poetry and the conceptual basis for poetic heiti and kynnings. It would be a grave mistake to conclude that Snorri's lists were all-inclusive or complete, or to assume he was always correct in his identifications. Therefore, it is critically important to discern the identity of any name encountered in the lore from characteristics and specific story elements associated with it, first and foremost, rather than linguistic speculation surrounding the meaning of the name, although the latter can certainly be of service. So while we know that Odin, Thor, and Freya have alternate names in our sources, we must realize that all other characters do as well, and that this technique was employed by the Skalds to satisfy the poetic requirements of alliteration and meter in Eddic verse forms. Even the tree Yggdrasil is called by different names, such as Yggdrasil's ash, Larather, Glasser, and Mjolkvidr, among others. Scholars still struggle with this today. In building the epic from the source material, understanding the various names and kynnings found in Old Norse poetry becomes crucial, and developing a well-supported storyline from this understanding allows us to examine the manuscripts in an objective way that does not contradict the original texts. Rydberg emphasizes throughout his investigations that he does not base any conclusion even on the most probable textual emendation, because even those for which the best reasons may be given do not furnish a sufficient basis for mythological investigation when the change is not supported by some manuscript or in and of itself is absolutely necessary. He notes that with text emendations, we can produce anything we like from the statements of the ancient records, noting that in mainstream scholarship, changes to the original text are numerous and usually quote Gylfaginning as authority. Thus, it is critically important that we investigate and adhere to the original words of the manuscripts whenever possible. As we have seen in this series, previous research methods have exposed their biases whenever they sought to alter the material through emendations and interpolations, when they felt that a particular passage did not fit their specific mold. Our modern translations and editions are rife with such changes, altering the original words of the manuscripts in places to make them more compatible to Snorri Sturluson's explanations, or worse, to agree with some modern scholars' personal interpretation. This is a major problem for us today, one that the Epic school alone can rectify, and one that Rydberg addressed when first formulating the method.
From a methodological standpoint, the first action required in regard to these sources is the purely linguistic task of putting at the researcher's disposal a complete collection of the existing texts, such as they have come down to our time, with full indication of the variant versions and with the most thorough elimination of all so-called text emendations. It need not to be said that text emendations can sometimes correctly remove a mistake made by transcribers. The methodic researcher, nevertheless, is bound to encounter mistakes in transcription along his way, but he cannot and should not allow himself to set foot into the uncertain territory which text emendations draw him, when they pertain to the substance of a thing. Such emendations always rest on the false premise that the redactor is completely familiar with the heathen complex of ideas, while his knowledge of it is usually defective, even if he is a historian of culture, a mythologist, and a linguist at the same time, which seldom is the case. Text emendation typically afflicts some place in the manuscript that seems unclear to the redactor, who then puts something clearer in its place. The premise is that the redactor knows everything that can occur within the conceptual contents of the text, and that which seems unclear to him thus cannot be correct. Text emendations can pertain to the factual contents, therefore have the unavoidable tendency of ridding the text of just such places that are of prime importance to the proper researchers, because in their obscurity, they possibly refer to something previously unexplained that perhaps can open new avenues for investigation.
Rydberg rightly felt that these text emendations are invariably text debasings, which undermine the source material and support a methodology that is capricious at best. There are numerous examples of this in our modern editions and translations. For example, few people realize that there are actually two separate manuscripts of the poem Völuspá, the Codex Regius manuscript and the Högsbok manuscript. Each one contains a different version of the poem, one is longer and one is shorter. For the first 20 verses, the two versions are closely similar, and the final 15 verses in both manuscripts show great similarities, with some distinct differences. But in the center of the poem, the order and number of the stanzas vary considerably, and each manuscript includes stanzas that the other does not, as well as showing variation in those stanzas which both manuscripts include. To complicate matters further, Snorri quotes, cites, and seeks to explain many of the stanzas of Völuspá in the Prose Edda, creating additional variance and confusion about their meaning. In modern editions, however, Völuspá is commonly presented as a single unified text, when in fact it is actually a composite of the two available manuscripts, re-edited to conform to Snorri's explanations. The truth is that in most all modern editions, the version of Völuspá we read is not found in any manuscript. It is a hybrid form, with a great number of emendations and omissions decided by modern scholars, under the influence of one or more of the previous schools of thought, typically using Snorri's Gylfaginning as their guide. From an epic standpoint, we get a much clearer view of old heathen belief by looking directly at what each manuscript of the poem has to say independently before drawing any conclusions. The epic school is the only one that advocates this. The case is much the same with other Eddic poems, where we have two manuscripts. Variant readings and lines are almost always omitted in modern editions. In the translation of Eddic and Skaldic poetry overall, most of which survive in a single manuscript, ambiguous phrases and lines are often paraphrased to fit a particular interpretation or gloss over a difficult passage, and on occasion individual words are redefined in specific passages to make them conform with statements in Snorri's Edda. The epic method follows a standard by which we examine the source material. We recognize that not all sources are of equal weight when it comes to ancient heathen belief. Simply said, some sources are conceptually closer to heathen belief than others, not just in time, but in content as well. Certainly Eddic and Skaldic poetry, composed in the heathen era by heathen skalds, contains the truest heathen content available, and therefore must be considered, first and foremost, as our primary source. All other sources must be ranked according to their value as a reliable source of heathen belief and weighted accordingly. Establishing a hierarchy of sources allows us to examine the material from a clear perspective and thereby identify what belongs to this religion and what does not. A lower source on the hierarchy can never contradict a primary source, since the lower source is proven to have a higher level of bias and misinformation than those closest to the actual religion. Only when we establish the Poetic Edda, along with Skaldic poetry, as the primary source of heathen belief, can we firmly enter into the field of reconstruction with a clear perspective on what we are looking for. We understand that our gods are real, that our ancient poetry refers to an epic history of the world, and that in our sources all mythic figures are called by many names. When we then accurately apply the theory of polyonymy, a grand tapestry begins to unfold, one that not only reunites the lore, but every single facet of the ancient religion. When we look for genuine heathen voices, there are 3 or perhaps 4 principal sources: Eddic poems, Skaldic verse composed within the heathen era, picture stones, rune stones, and other heathen artifacts, contemporary accounts of heathens by outside observers. Dating the material can be problematic. While some of the Eddic poems may have been composed after the conversion of Iceland, particularly those found in late paper manuscripts, and some Skaldic verse, especially those recorded in sagas after Snorri's time, There is little debate that the bulk of Eddic and Skaldic poetry contain authentic heathen material. They are composed in the native language. They are polytheistic in nature and do not contain any direct references to Christianity. Although the oldest manuscripts of the Eddic poems can only be dated to the 13th century, that is not to say that these poems did not originate much earlier. Eddic poetry bears all the hallmarks of oral traditional verse, including alliteration, repetition, and formulaic construction, with direct analogues in both Old English and Old High German poetry. Internal evidence indicates that the Eddic songs are the last vestiges of the ancient oral histories of the Germanic people, which Tacitus, writing in the 1st century AD, says form the only memory and annals of their past. The oldest manuscripts show signs of having been copied from earlier manuscripts, which were compiled into collections. Indigenous historians such as Snorri Sturluson in Iceland and Saxo Grammaticus in Denmark used these songs as sources and considered them ancient in their own time. It is even possible that they were working from written texts of the same kind that survive today for study. Thus, the Poetic Edda and Skaldic poetry are the height of all the sources. The words and ideas found in these poems form the primary basis for our understanding of the ancestral wisdom. They can never be contradicted or corrected by any later source, and must be examined first in order to establish any theory or line of research, by comparing what other poems have to say on the matter before turning to any secondary source. We must remember that these poems do not tell stories and do not provide much detail. They were not designed to. Instead, they allude to stories that the intended audience knew well, referring to whole myths in a few words, evoking images that bring entire myths to mind. As a rule, there was no need to explain details that the audience already knew. Therefore, we must keep in mind that these poems, as the highest art form of the heathen era, often operate on different levels and may have multiple layers of meaning that cannot be captured in translation. Thus, it is critical to pay close attention to the exact words and names a poet chooses, and note where else the same language and imagery occur to illuminate the text. Runic inscriptions, picture stones, amulets, idols, and other artifacts from the heathen era can be useful to confirm and support our findings, along with contemporary accounts of Germanic heathens by outsiders such as pagan Romans, as well as later Christian and Islamic authors who encountered or had knowledge of heathens and heathen practices in their own times. All these can be considered primary sources when compared to the poetic sources. Any ancient source based on or seeking to explain the old heathen poetry can be considered a secondary source. The Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson has a unique place among our sources. It is both a primary and a secondary work, in the sense that it quotes as well as seeks to explain old heathen poetry. Snorri's Edda was not intended to be a book of mythology, as it is seen today, but was intended and thought of during the Middle Ages as a book of poetics, teaching contemporary Christian poets how to compose new verse in the style of the old heathen skalds. Snorri was a historian, known for his historic sagas, such as those contained in Heimskringla. Like all Icelanders, he was proud of his country and heritage and wanted to preserve the old arts, which were in a state of rapid decay during his time, as traditional poetics gave way to rhymed couplets and romantic literature flooding in from the continent after the conversion of Iceland. Within a century of Snorri's time, romantic literature dominated Icelandic culture. His Edda created a temporary revival of skaldic poetry among Christian poets for almost a century afterward. The first 9 books of Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum should be seen in the same light as Snorri's Edda. It is a euhemerized work using the Eddic poems as its source, and therefore, like Snorri's Edda, is a secondary source of information. However, because Gesta Danorum is more heavily euhemerized than the Prose Edda, we can use the latter as a source to critique it, always remaining underneath the umbrella of the Poetic Edda and Skaldic poetry. Both Saxo and Snorri euhemerized the mythic material they found in Eddic poems, but the reason for doing so was not the same. Snorri's intent in Gylfaginning is to provide enough information about the gods and their history to support his teaching of kennings and other skaldic techniques to contemporary Christian poets to compose new poems in the old heathen style. In Ynglinga Saga, the opening chapter of his Heimskringla, Snorri uses the same fictional narrative about Odin that he presents in the preface of Gylfaginning as actual history, demonstrating that he understood the traditional poems as a heathen memory and annal of the past. Thus, in Snorri's work, the material is more recognizable. The large body of work found in the Icelandic sagas and Fornalda sagas provides us with a litany of materials by which we can discern not only the religious beliefs of our ancestors, but also their religious practices. By identifying what we call lines of convergence from one source to another, utilizing our hierarchy, we can build well-supported theories surrounding almost any topic regarding the practice of the faith. When we can show that these practices are verified by primary sources or by secondary sources that do not contradict them, we can put the puzzle pieces in place that allow us to rebuild our culture from the ground up. Using this hierarchy, we have developed many theories that fly in the face of mainstream academic research. This is understandable considering that these scholars have rejected the religiosity of these traditions, denied the divinity of our deities, and have used Snorri's Edda, a Christian euhemerist account, as the primary basis of their research. When people see that we identify Hel as Urd, the giant Thjazi as Völundr, our Minglad of Fjolsvindsmal as the goddess Freya, and its hero Svipdag as her husband Odr, and that we place all three roots of Yggdrasil in the lower world, contradicting Snorri's model which places the roots on different vertical planes, they might think that we are relying on personal unverified gnosis or willfully spreading misinformation. But in fact, these are well-supported conclusions when one does not use Snorri as their primary source. All of these conclusions are firmly rooted in the poetic Edda and skaldic poetry.
Besides building a hierarchy of sources, we have also developed a hierarchy of research methods, which allows us to further support our investigations. By understanding the way in which we look at the information, we can establish rules of functionality in establishing a practice or piece of lore. Of course, nothing trumps a direct statement in a primary source. However, we rarely find things stated plainly in our poetic sources. And even when we do, there often can be multiple ways to interpret and apply that information. Thus, drawing lines of convergence between native sources gives us a greater understanding of how the ancient religion was practiced. In addition to these tools, the study of linguistics and, more broadly, the Indo-European comparative mythology can be of use. No amount of theorizing or linguistic research will trump direct quotes from the source material. We have seen all sorts of bizarre theories made up by people trying to convince us to look away from the sources and trust them instead. Drawing lines of convergence between native sources can give us a greater understanding of how the ancient religion was practiced. By using the above hierarchy of source material, we can build the puzzle of the faith to show the people how it can be practiced today. Comparisons between differing Teutonic sources can help us build proper theories surrounding the traditions, but can never trump direct citations. Looking at the definitions and etymology of words can give us a perspective on something that may be difficult to puzzle out. However, the study into language and its origin should only be used to strengthen arguments from the above, and never to create storylines or ideas that negate the actual lore. Investigations into the Indo-European sources have proven incredibly fruitful and should be a part of our work. However, no foreign source should ever negate or contradict what can be gleaned from the native sources. The Vedas, the Upanishads, and other Indo-European sources can help us add details and strengthen arguments, but we do not allow syncretism to corrupt our traditions. While the study of symbols can help provide us with a guide towards looking at the inner psychology of the material, at the end of the day, we should always consider its extreme subjectivity. One piece of lore may be seen in different lights, one comparison may be stronger than another, or one concept may have multiple meanings. While we can use symbols to build other arguments, they should never stand alone.
The basic concept of the epic method is the understanding that the entire corpus of Germanic lore fits within an established mythic timeline known to all Germanic tribes, joined together with actual human events. This timeline is most clearly seen in the poem Völuspá, which chronicles the beginning of the ages when time was young, with the formation of the first living beings in Ginnungagap, then further moves towards the creation of the worlds, the creation of man, the exploits of Odin and Thor, all the way up to Ragnarok. By understanding the sanctity of this epic timeline, and properly piecing it together from the surviving sources is part of the grand mystery that makes up our religion. It is not that we demand absolute fealty to every word written within our text, but rather that we understand that it is the epic itself that is sacred and important to us. In order to understand how the timeline is pieced together, the episodes are categorized according to the hierarchy of sources and then arranged by applying simple logic to the many temporal references the lore contains. Using this method, the pieces begin to fall into place, one by one, and the overall epic chain they form not only validates each individual placement, but the epic method itself. One cannot simply unsee the epic once they have seen it, nor can one easily dismiss it as an incorrect interpretation, since a convergence of several sources supports the placement of each episode in the chain of events. As previously discussed, our school is the only school of thought that seeks to understand the lore without interpolation or emendation. Thus, we wish to work with the manuscripts in their purest form. In doing so, we often find further validation to the ideas we have accepted as facts, and thus stand on a firm footing when discussing our beliefs. Everyone is welcome to question what they are based on. As an unexpected byproduct of restoring the mythic epic, Rydberg rediscovered the ancient heathen worldview present in the primary sources. It is the way that ancient heathens saw the world around them. The heathen worldview consists of a three-tier system, superimposed on the world tree, with its branches in heaven and its three roots all below the earth. In its branches, we find Asgard, the home of the gods, set over Midgard, the home of men. Larger than Midgard, a vast underworld known as Jormungandr spreads out below, serving as a foundation for the created worlds, with a realm called Niflhel in the cold north, from which the spring Hvergelmir flows, and a realm called Hel in the warm south, where we find Urdr's well. Mimir's sacred grove is situated in between them, where Ginnungagap once was. Suspended above Jormungandr, Midgard is an island surrounded by a vast sea, contained in a great mill box, whose moorings rest on the underworld. This massive mill churns in the sea, causing the ebb and flow of the tides. High above Midgard, the skull of the primal giant Ymir rests on the top of the millstone, serving as the dome of the sky. The steady motion of the millstones causes the rotation of the starry canopy of heaven, and the constellations set in the underside of Ymir's skull. The eye of the millstone sits over Hvergelmir, which opens on the sea in a maelstrom off the coast of Denmark. This is how ancient heathens saw their world. Their myths were a part of their reality. The cosmology outlined in Snorri's Edda stands in stark contrast to this model. In Snorri's view, the gods were human men from Asia who built a bridge to heaven and established a court there, where they met daily. This is based on a euhemerized reading of Grimnismal 30, which says that the gods rode from their home daily up over Bifrost to Urdr's well. Snorri imagined that the Aesir were men who lived at the center of Midgard, in the classical city of Troy. Thus he imagined that they rode up to Urdr's well in the sky. To the old heathen poets, Asgard was a celestial city from which the gods rode downward to Urdr's well daily. Having moved Urdr's well to heaven, Snorri incorrectly placed Mimir's well in Jotunheim, parallel to Midgard, and left Hvergelmir alone in the underworld, creating an equal distribution of the three wells in heaven, earth, and hell, according to a Christian concept of the cosmos. By upending the roots of the tree in this manner, Snorri has effectively laid the tree on its side, felling Yggdrasil, as effectively as Boniface felled Thor's oak, shattering the old heathen concept of the cosmos. When we logically arrange the episodes mentioned in Völuspá, we gain a basic outline of how the epic unfolds. From there we can expand the storyline with details found in other Eddic poems, and then apply information from secondary sources, such as the narratives of Snorri Sturluson and Saxo Grammaticus, that do not contradict the master timeline obtained from the Poetic Edda, our primary source. Then we can turn to other sources such as tribal histories,
the Fölnaldr sagas, Beowulf, the Merseburg charms, and more that will help us along. The list of total episodes that make up this epic is quite long, but here we can see the basic outline obtained from Völuspá. By using this timeline as our basic framework for the epic, we can then add additional episodes based on the hierarchy of sources, making sure that they withstand the tests of the epic. For instance, most of the episodes in the Prose Edda regarding Thor's adventures are supported by the Poetic Edda and can be included. However, elements of Snorri's prose accounts, such as that describing Kvasir's death and the creation of the mead of poetry, conflict with the story of Odin's theft of the mead at Gunnlod's, as it is told in Havamal, and thus are not. The episode dealing with Odin and Rindr found in Saxo's Gesta Danorum Book 3 is confirmed by references in Völuspá, Baldur's Drámur, and Lokasenna, so it can be concluded. But many of the episodes in his euhemerized accounts cannot be recognized, and thus cannot be used. Having first developed a standard by which we can include or exclude episodes, we then begin rebuilding our epic. Piece by piece, episode by episode, an epic storyline unfolds that we can see was intrinsic to the beliefs of our ancestors, and thereby finally restore the native narrative history that has been holy and sacred to our people since ancient times. We published our attempt at rebuilding this epic in 2009 and called it the Ásatrú Edda. Since then, we have created the Odinist Edda, or more anglicized version, the Ásatrú Edda 2nd edition, and the Runic Edda, which was an illuminated manuscript written entirely in runes. We shall continue working on this, and future versions will likely arise as our work evolves and our research capabilities improve. The idea is to demonstrate that ours is the superior method in reconstructing the sacred lore of the ancient North, and that no other school of thought could even begin to attempt such a thing. We have demonstrated in the videos of this series that the stories of our gods are a native religious tradition of our ancestors, and that our investigative method is the only one that begins and ends with this in mind. They are not embodiments of foreign deities as explained in the Interpretatio school. They are not ancient kings and queens that tricked the people into worshipping them as gods and goddesses, which we find in the Euhemerus school. They are not rehashed Bible characters as found in the Biblical school. They are not personifications of weather phenomena as presented in the Nature school, and they are not figments of our imagination as demonstrated by the Archetypal school. They are gods and goddesses, the native gods and goddesses of the Teutonic people, and their worship is part of a religious system that can be recognized, codified, and fully reconstructed once we recognize this fact. We not only see the vast potential within this reconstruction, we can fully discern that by refusing to accept this very simple and obvious fact, any attempt at reconstruction is an impossibility, even an absurdity. One does not need to restore a dead belief system saturated with false images, vague symbolism, or archaic principles, and if one views this faith as such, this is certainly the case. But when you validate the actual faith and categorize this within the psychological spectrum of religious belief, you begin to recognize the possibilities of developing a truly sacred structure with solid, evidence-based research. A grand puzzle lies before you, with each piece carefully laid in its place for the full tradition to unfold. While it has taken a lifetime to put many of the pieces back together, each piece not only brings to life what was once thought to be a lost custom, it also continues to demonstrate the validity of the method we use and the school that we have developed. We are here as actual practitioners of the ancient Teutonic religion, and as such, our purpose is to fully reconstruct the entire culture that was once the basis of Northern European civilization. By methodically approaching the sources left to us, we can discern that the faith our ancestors lived by survived within these ancient texts, and that we can rebuild from them. The tradition existed within a cultural chain that lasted for thousands of years, which was severed when the European tribes were converted to a foreign creed. The standard we have developed, along with the hierarchies we have established for source material and methodology, has enabled us to delve deeper into this reconstruction than we ever thought possible. We are here to build a foundation of religious belief, while at the same time demonstrating that an evidence-based method of research building upon the ancient sacred epic is the most comprehensive and provable approach to the material. The approach we take towards establishing our litmus is one of direct evidence, looking at the sources without emendation or interpolation. From there, we will examine the sources based upon a hierarchy of their importance within the investigations. These always start with the Poetic Edda and Skaldic poetry, as these are the true heathen voices on the religion, and no other source should be allowed to contradict them. The people that wrote them were actual practitioners of the faith, people who lived and died by the rites of our gods and goddesses. Not foreign observers, not religious propagandists hostile to the faith, and not false academics instilling their biases. By applying this standard to every investigation, we gain a perspective on the ancient religion that brings us closer to our gods, to our ancestors, and to an actual polytheist religion. By applying the epic method to our research, we have been able to look not only at lore, but at many different aspects of the ancient culture, and find elements of it that were previously untouched. Within our books, we have demonstrated fully that the ancient epic can be seen and reconstructed in a way that is cohesive and comprehensive. The ancient skalds knew this epic and drew their inspiration from it. They told tales of it around their homes, to their children and families. By establishing this storyline, we have made sense of the poetry in a way that no one else could. When they have emendated, we have deduced. When they have interpolated, we have built upon. When one research method has to rely upon mutilating source text to make ideas fit a certain mold, and another does not, it becomes clear which is the superior way of investigating these sources.